In this session, I'm going to start talking about some of the early covenantal ideas and frameworks that we have in Scripture. Before the flood, we have three major covenant ideas in the Bible. The first has to do with Eden, the Garden of Eden, creation, how it was set up, and Adam and Eve placed into it. The second one is Adam and Eve themselves, how God deals with Adam and Eve after the fall. And then we have, of course, the covenant that emerges at the time of Noah and the flood. And that's what we call prior to the flood, or antediluvian, before the flood. Diluvian meaning deluge, and so the ante, before, diluvian, before the flood. After the flood, God has pushed the reset button on the human population, and there's a repopulating of the earth, and we move into a different kind of phase of the journey. Now, to begin with, we have the idea of Eden, and God creates this Eden and he sets things in place. And we pick this up in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And so Adam and Eve were put into Eden, and we get the idea from the language that speaks of image. They were made in his image, that they are like the icon from the Greek, the image of God. They were not put up into the garden as gods to possess it, but to have dominion over it as stewards accountable to God. And if you're in any way familiar with the Bible and the story of Genesis, you realize that it quickly went wrong. But into this Eden, God places Adam and Eve as image bearers of God, and who carry authority given to them by God. It's not their authority, and they are given dominion over creation. This is one of the first real covenantal frameworks that we find in the Bible, and it's kind of just from God. Adam and Eve are not in a position to negotiate or essentially respond. They are created, there they exist, and they're placed into this place called Eden. Then if we move on in Genesis and we go to the whole time of Adam himself, Adam and Eve, we go to Genesis chapter 3, and Adam and Eve have made choices which have now rejected the image of God, rejected the authority of God, and rejected accountability to God. And they have moved into this place that we now call, as Christians people, a place of sin. And here in chapter 3, verse 14, God is speaking, and he says to the serpent, who was the agent, as it were, of the temptation. He says, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock, and above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." These words from early Genesis, of course, echoed in New Testament and are referenced points for New Testament writings and the canon, what became the New Testament, as a pointer which connects, of course, the problem, the human problem, alienation from God, rebellion against God, and all that resulted from that, loss of relationship with God, and of course, ultimately, in the covenant of Christ and the covenant of his death, this final victory. Now, in this covenant, we have the fallenness of the human being, the fallenness of humanity, the cursing of Satan, and the promise, in fact, that at some point there shall be a redeemer, a spiritual and physical death does result from the rebellion of Adam and Eve, but there is the promise of a redemption and a crushing of the evil one at some future point. Then if we move on to Noah, and we go to Genesis, for example, chapters 6, verse 18, chapter 8, verse 20, through chapter 9, verse 6. And we haven't time in this session to read all of those. But I want to turn to Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. Now, Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Here in this covenant of Noah, with Noah, or the Noahic covenant, um, there is a resumption of life, resumption of humanity's dominion over creation, but it's now all pretty broken and corrupt. And although there's a restart and a new day, it's a new day in a fallen world. And although there's been this great judgment, this terrible sweeping judgment across the face of the earth, it's like God sees that the state of the human heart, our tendency is to choose death over life. But he restarts the human story. And in this covenant that God makes with Noah, he takes the rainbow and he gives it as this covenant sign that every human being in every culture in all time, anywhere on the globe, will be able to see and should be able to know. So it isn't the sign of the covenant. It's not localized only to Israel or to Egypt or some tight geographic area. And so there are a number of key points in the covenant with Noah. One, it is initiated by God. Number two, it is universal, timeless. It applies to all people everywhere. It is unconditional. God just simply makes the covenant and says, this is the way it is. And it's everlasting. There's no time limit. There's no shelf life on this covenant. And the final thing is that all things created by God are affected by this covenant. It's not just human beings. It's everything that is God has created. And of course, everything that's alive, any animal and creature that could possibly die, or in the sense as things did in the flood. So it's instituted by God, it's universal, it is unconditional, it's everlasting, and it affects everything that God has created. And so we have the covenant in Eden, we have the covenant with Adam, and we have the covenant with Noah. At the end of the day, as we will see in other covenants, there is always overriding the great eternal covenant that God makes with his creation, that he will redeem his creation back to himself. So even though all of these little covenants, and some of them are major, like we will get to with Abraham, Moses, and David, and Jesus, these are the major covenants. All covenants in the Bible, in a way, somehow reflect the commitment of God to redeem his creation back to himself.